going to be subtracting mixed numbers with borrowing. So sometimes when you subtract mixed numbers, you're not going to be able to take the bottom fraction from the top fraction. So in that case, you are going to have to borrow from the whole number. So let's try some. So we want to subtract 7 minus 2 and 5/8. Well, I can't just bring the 5/8 down because this is a subtraction problem. So I have to subtract 5/8 from something. But if you notice, there's nothing up here. So it's like I'm subtracting 5/8 from 0. Well, I can't take something from nothing. I can't take 5/8 from 0. So I'm going to have to borrow. Just like we borrow when we're borrowing and we're just multiplying whole numbers. So when I borrow, I'm going to borrow from the 7. And the 7 is going to become a 6. Now, I took off one whole, so I have to put one whole back on. It needs to look like a fraction. It needs to have the same denominator as the other fraction, and it has to equal one whole. Well, it has to have the same denominator, so the denominator has to be 8. And it has to equal one whole. Well, in order for it to equal one whole, that means my numerator has to be 8 as well. So now I can take 5/8 from 8/8. And 8/8 minus 5/8 is 3/8. And 6 minus 2 is 4. I'm going to check my answer to make sure it's in its simplest form. And I see that it is. So my answer is 4 3/8. So let's try another one. Again, I want to subtract these two. I cannot take 2/3 from nothing, so I will have to borrow. I'm going to borrow from the 5, and the 5 is going to become a 4. I took off one, so I have to put it back on. It has to be a fraction. It has to have the same denominator as the other fraction, and it has to equal one whole. So that means my denominator has to be a 3. And in order for this fraction to equal one whole, my numerator has to also be 3. So now I can take 2/3 from 3/3, and 3/3 minus 2/3 is 1/3, and 4 minus 3 is 1. I'm going to check my fraction to make sure it's in its simplest form. It is, so my final answer is 1 1/3. So now I want to do this problem. I want to do 11 1/6 minus 5 2/3. Before I can do any type of subtraction, I have to get a common denominator. So I need to look at 3 and 6, and I can say that my common denominator will be 6. So 6 will be my new denominator. So now I need to see, well, how did I get from 3 to 6? Well, I multiplied by 2. Whatever you do to the bottom, do to the top. And then how did I get from 6 to 6? I multiplied by 1. So whatever you do to the bottom, do to the top. I'm going to bring my whole number back in front. Now I want to subtract these, but I see that I can't take 4/6 from 1/6. I can't take this bottom fraction from this top fraction, so I am going to have to borrow. So I'm going to borrow from the 11, and the 11 will become 10. I took off 1, so I have to put 1 back on. It has to be a fraction. It has to have the same denominator as the other fractions, and it must equal one whole. So my denominator has to be 6, and my numerator has to be 6 so that it equals one whole. But I can't just forget about this fraction that was already here. So what I'm going to have to do, I'm going to have to add these together, and that's going to equal 7/6. Then I'm going to put the whole number back in front of 7/6. And I'm going to use the 10 because remember, we already borrowed, so that's no longer 11, it's 10 now. And now I'm going to subtract 5 and 4/6. When I subtract them, 7/6 minus 4/6 gives me 3/6. And 10 minus 5 is 5. I'm going to check my answer to see if it's in its simplest form. Well, I see that 3/6 is not in its simplest form. It can be simplified. 3 and 6 can both be divided by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 6 divided by 3 is 2. Again, putting my whole number back in front. So my final answer is 5.5. All right, let's do one more before it's your turn. So I'm doing 4 and 5/12 minus 1 and 3/4. Again, before I can do any type of subtraction, I have to get a common denominator. So my new denominator will be 12. So now I need to see, well, how did I get from 4 to 12? I multiply times 3. Whatever I do to the bottom, do to the top. And then how did I get from 12 to 12? I multiply by 1, so that I need to do the same to the top. Put my whole number back in front so that I don't forget them. Now I want to subtract, but I can't take 9/12 from 5/12. I can't take a bigger fraction from a smaller fraction, so I will have to borrow. So I'm going to borrow from the 4, and the 4 will become 3. Now, I took off 1. I have to put 1 back on. It has to be a fraction. It has to have the same denominator as the other fraction. So my denominator needs to be 12, which means my numerator has to be 12 so that it equals 1 whole. And remember, I can't forget about the fraction that was already there. So as you can see, we have to add them. So that gives me 17 over 12. Put my whole number back in front. And remember, we're going to use the 3 because we already borrowed from the 4. So it's not 4 anymore. It's 3 now. So I'm going to use my 3. And now I'm going to subtract 1 and 9/12. 17/12 minus 9/12 is 8/12. And 3 minus 1 is 2. Of course, I need to check to see if my answer is in its simplest form. And when I look at 8/12, I see that 8/12 can be divided by 4. So I'm going to divide 8 by 4, and I'm going to divide 12 by 4, and that equals 2 over 3. And then, of course, we have to put the whole number back in front, and I'm going to put it down here, so our final answer is 2 and 2/3. So, now it's your turn. I want you to try these two problems on your own. So at this time, go ahead, pause the taping, try number 1 and number 2 by yourself, then turn the tape back on so that you can see if you got it correct or not. So go ahead and begin. Great, so hopefully you've done number 1 and number 2 by yourself. So now let's see if you got it correct. So let's start with number 1. So we want to do 8 minus 3 and 4/5. Now, in order for us to subtract these, I see that I have 4/5 here, but there's nothing here, and I can't take something from nothing. So I'm hoping that you borrowed. Hopefully you borrowed from the 8 and you made it 7. So I took off 1, so I've got to put 1 back on. It has to be a fraction. It has to have the same denominator, and it has to equal 1 whole. So hopefully your fraction has a denominator of 5 and a numerator of 5. Now you can subtract. 5 over 5 minus 4 over 5 is 1 over 5. And 7 minus 3 is 4. Of course, we always check to see if our answer is in its simplest form. And 4 and 1/5 is, so our final answer is 4 and 1/5. If you got 4 and 1/5, you did it correct. Great job. If you didn't get 4 and 1/5, then go back a little bit, look at some more examples again, come back, try it one more time to see if you can get 4 and 1/5. So now let's check number 2. So I have 1 and 3 and 3/8 minus 1 and 3/4. So I want to subtract these two fractions. I have to get a common denominator first. So my new denominator will be 8. So now I need to see, how did I get from 4 to 8? I multiply by 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. Now I want to see, how did I get from 8 to 8? I multiplied by 1. Whatever I do to the bottom, I want to do to the top. I want to put my whole number back in front. Now I see I can't take 6/8 from 3/8, so I am going to have to borrow, and hopefully you borrowed. Hopefully you borrowed from the 3 and you turned it into a 2. Hopefully you took off 1 and put it back on. I hope it looks like a fraction. I hope the denominator is the same as these, and I hope it equals 1 whole. If you did, then that means your fraction would be 8 over 8. Now, you had to add the 8 over 8 to the 3 over 8 that was already there, and that should give you 11 over 8. And then, of course, you want to put the 2 back in front, and now we can subtract 1 and 6/8. 11/8 minus 6/8 is 5/8, and 2 minus 1 is 1. Of course, we have to check to see if our answer is in its simplest form. It is, so this will be our final answer, 1 and 5/8. Now let's do a word problem. I want you to read this word problem. I want you to try it on your own. Make sure you use Cutie Pack, underlining the question, circling important information. Make sure you look for your clue word, then solve it. Pause the tape, try the problem, then when you're done, unpause it, come back, and then check your answer to see how you did. Okay, great. So, hopefully you've done this problem on your own. So now let's check it to see how you did. So, let's start by reading our word problem. On Monday, the snowfall in the mountains was 15 3/4 inches. On Tuesday, the snowfall was 18 1/2 inches. What was the difference in snowfall? So our question is, what was the difference in snowfall? And now we need to find our data, and we know that on Monday we had 15 3/4 inches, and then on Tuesday we had 18 1/2 inches. And now we need to look for our clue word, and hopefully you found that the word difference is the clue word, and this does mean subtraction. So we're going to have to subtract to get our answer. So we're going to subtract 18 1/2 minus 15 3/4. So we're going to set up our problem, 18 1/2 minus 15 3/4. Before we can subtract these, we have to get a common denominator. If we look at our fraction, our common denominator will be 4. So our new denominator is 4. So now we're going to see how do we get from 4 to 4. We multiply by 1, whatever we do to the bottom, do to the top. Then how do we get from 2 to 4? We multiply by 2. So whatever we do to the bottom, do to the top. We want to bring our whole numbers back in front so that we don't forget them. Now we want to subtract, but we can't take 3/4 from 2/4, so we're going to have to borrow from the whole number. So 18, we're going to borrow from that, and it's going to become 17. We took off 1, so we need to put 1 back on. It needs to be a fraction. It needs to have the same denominator as the other fractions, and it needs to equal 1 whole. So, hopefully your fraction has a denominator of 4 and your numerator is 4. And hopefully you added it back to the 2/4 that was already there. So now 2/4 plus 4/4 is 6/4. And now we put our 17 back in front and make sure it's the 17 because we already borrowed from the 18, so it's not 18 anymore. And now we're going to subtract 15 3/4. And that gives us a final answer of 2 3/4. We check it, make sure it's in its simplest form. It is. So our answer is 2 3/4. Hopefully you got 2 3/4. If you did, great. Hopefully this has been some help to you. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me the next time that you see me. Also, you can always go back through this video again, watch it as many times as you need to until you get it. And hopefully you have a great day.